I did this render of these PS5 shapes swirling around a PS5 controller quite a while ago now, shortly after those new rigid body dynamics dropped. And a bunch of you have been leaving comments and wanting me to make this tutorial, so I'm going to make it. It was something I strayed away from a little bit because there was a lot of RBD simulation tutorials coming out, and I kind of felt like the method was evidently already out there, but people kind of want to see my take on it, see how I approached it, and really, you know, you're here for the look that I bring to things. So I'm more than happy to make a tutorial, but of course I do want to shout out 3D Bonfire's tutorials on these RBD simulations, because I do remember when they came out following his tutorials to get this result. So credit is due where credit is due. I'll leave a couple of his tutorials in the description because he goes into it in amazing depth. As usual for the Christmas calendar, if you've watched the last couple of tutorials, you know the drill. The first 5 people that hit the link in the top of the description will get my Patreon for free for the first month, and for the first 2 hours, the second link below that, if you use the code RBD, then you'll get 50% off for the first few hours after this tutorial goes live. With all that being said, let's get making these cool simulations. As you can imagine, my first thought coming into making these simulations was, how do we make the shapes? We've got to make those iconic PlayStation shapes. And 3 out of 4 of the shapes, you know, if you're looking at the icons that are on the controller, X, Y, I'm going to get this mixed up with Xbox. What is it? X, circle, triangle, and square. We can do 3 out of 4 of these shapes with a tube. So we're going to drop in a tube, and basically what we're going to do, so this would be circle, right? Let's make the inner radius something like 80, or let's do 75. Let's make the outer radius, you know, we want a decent amount of thickness there, but what we really want is some height, so let's make the height something like 100. And that'll be our circle. Maybe it's a little bit too thick. Maybe we could do 80 there. So we've got our circle, right? We're going to add a bunch of rotation segments. I'm going to duplicate this tube because we're going to come back to it. And we also want all of these shapes to have the same height, the same depth to them. We're going to turn off that first tube, and that's just like I said, so we can come back to it. We're going to Shift C, and we're going to drop in a volume builder. And for these simulations to work well, we need the geometry to be even, and also when it comes to some of the other shapes, this is going to be useful. So we're going to set the voxel size to 1, and then we're going to do Shift C again and type in volume measure. I'm going to drop that in. And now you have a look at this, you can see that we've got completely even polygons all over the model, but we need to go to the volume builder and drop in this thing called an SDF smooth. Have a look at that now. Now we've got this really, really nice bevel, which is going to look nice with the kind of material that we're going to use. And I want this tutorial to be a little bit more straightforward today. I want this tutorial to be less about playing around and really just about zooming you through straight to the result. And a lot of my tutorials recently, especially during this Christmas calendar, have been very much a little bit more me playing about. And I always appreciate a good tutorial that's just make this value, make this value, this value. So that's what we're going to do. The next thing we're going to need is a remesh, and holding Alt, then hit enter or click that and it will go on the top. But we're going to set the mesh density to about 25% because we don't want these too dark. A good rule of thumb here is we're going to want to see more light than dark. If you remesh this and you see more dark than light, then there's probably a little bit too many polygons. Even this is probably a little bit too many, so I would probably maybe attempt 15%, because this can get pretty slow, especially with the kind of count that we're going to use inside the cloner. So we really kind of want this at a decent level. That's probably more what we're looking for. What we can do now is just press C on that, and we can call this circle. We can turn that off, duplicate the tube, and this is going to be our triangle. So how do we get the triangle? Well, what we do is, how many points does this triangle have? 3. We're going to bring those rotation segments to 3 on the cylinder. If we press F4, grab that tube, grab our rotation tool, and we're going to rotate this 30 degrees so it's completely straight. And then we're going to do the same thing, volume builder, drop that in there, set it to 1, add in an SDF smooth, volume measure. Now we have this meshed, but there's a little bit of a grievance I have with this, and that's that after we've added that SDF smooth, and even just after kind of running it I think actually just dropping the rotation segments, but none of it's really important. What's happened is we've lost a lot of that thickness, and like I said, we want that thickness to be there. So, for example, we can turn those off for a second. We can bring down that inner radius until they sort of match, because we want these to kind of retain a similar thickness level. Can maybe just come up, bring that to 50, because that volume builder is going to reel it in a little bit. Actually, let's do 60. 60 seems a little bit better, maybe 55. That kind of seems like the ballpark. Now what we can do again is grab the remesh, drop that in there, set it to 20%. And that's looking pretty good. If we turn off the circle though, we just want to kind of make sure that the mesh everywhere is pretty much the same. For example, you can see here it's kind of tweaking out a little bit on the right side. We can get around that by, for example, doing, I think it would be symmetric X. And that's going to kind of get rid of some of these kinks, which is going to help our simulation a little bit in the long run. And now hopefully, well, I've clearly hit the wrong thing here. Would it be Z or Y? I thought Y was going to flip it and then destroy the triangle. Apparently that's worked though. But there's even more kinks. I don't know. Apparently that's not working very well. It's not too much of an issue, to be honest with you. It looks like with neither of them on, dealing with those kind of slight tightness in the polygons is probably worthwhile. What I do want to look at as well though is the bevel on this is, I want to say it's maybe a little bit too aggressive, and the fastest way around that would be to drop the voxel size even more. So if we did something like 0.6 for example, that's going to tighten up that bevel. Unfortunately, it is going to add more polygons, which means that we're going to need to drop the remesh even more, and then it's going to make the calculation times longer. But I think it's worth it to get a better result. Just to wait a couple more seconds, and if we have a look at this now, you can see that that's gotten a little bit denser. We could just probably drop that to something like 15%. I think that value is probably still fine, but I have attempted to record this tutorial about a week ago, and I wasn't being very as spacious with the mesh density and stuff. And when it came around to the simulation, because it was a while ago I made these simulations now, it was probably about 6-7 months ago. When it was coming around to the simulation, I was getting bitten a little bit and dealing with long calculation times, which wasn't useful for the tutorial. This is probably more what we're going for. We can make that editable, drag it out of the null, call it triangle. What we want though is we want these to be the same size. Press W here, we get back to our world axis. They feel pretty much the same size right now, but I think what I want to do, coming back to that F4 view, is just sort of have the bottom of the triangle, that flat face, and the top of the triangle touching with the circle. And that's going to feel more, I want to say, like the true size. And then we can bring that on the y-axis back up to 0. Or do we actually want them to kind of sit inside of each other? And it's going to knock off the axes a little bit, but I think that's more what we're going for. Somewhere along the way we've generated a bit more thickness, but it's okay because we can just scale that in. And yeah, I think something, yeah, we'll just bring it up there. I think something like that should work fine. Maybe we can scale it in a little bit. Again, we just kind of want them all roughly the same size. So now what we're going to do is come back to the tube, duplicate it again, go to the object. This time we're going to do, you guessed it, 4 rotation segments. We're going to press F4 again, come to that front view, grab our rotation tool. We're going to rotate this time 45 degrees. And we're going to repeat the same process again. We're going to grab a volume builder, set that to 1, SDF smooth, volume measure, and a remesh. And again, just before this remesh, you can see we've lost a little bit of thickness there. So let's bring down that outer radius, matching it with the circle. Let's do 60. That looks accurate. And then we can drop in the remesh. Again, Shift C, remesh, holding Alt, pressing Enter or double clicking here. And we'll set this to 20%. Thickness on that is probably a tad too thick. So let's just bring this up to 70. That's probably something I'm a bit more happy with. And I do believe when I made these simulations the first time, I was quite strict on getting them all the same thickness and looking the same. But should we have a look at this? They're all sort of feeling in the same ballpark. I may actually just go back. I do apologize. I may actually just go back and increase that thickness once more. So looking at this tube, let's try 65. 65 feels a bit more like it. We'll let that calculate, and then we'll move on to making, we've saved the hardest one for last, the X. Coolio. So we will make that editable, and we will call it square. Now we've got our square, our triangle, and our circle. Let's make that square a little bit bigger, just sort of match it there to the size of the circle. Check that mesh density, it's looking pretty good. Now we're going to do the X. I'm going to map the X, probably, just make sure these sizes are similar enough, probably to the size of the square. So a little bit of a different setup here. We can't use the tube for this. We're going to grab a cube. Let's press F3, make it as thick as the square icon. Press F4, and we're going to make it a whole bunch thinner. We're probably going to want to match this kind of thickness here, right? So we can bring that back to the middle. I held shift there to get that to snap. What we're going to do, holding this axis here, we're going to rotate this 45 degrees, and then we're going to match it just to the kind of edges there, and then we're going to hold control and shift and rotate it 90 degrees. We can turn off the square now, come back to our main view, and now we've got this X. Have a little look here. Well, this is where the volume builder is important, is because we need this mesh to connect. We need fluent bevels, and the best way to achieve that is the volume builder. So what I'm going to do, just in case, is duplicate those, right click on them, connect objects and delete, grab the volume builder. Now those objects are going to weld together, and then we're going to grab the volume measure. You can see now that we've got these perfect bevels along the object. It's perfectly welded together, and we have our X shape. So all we would need now is that remesh. Actually, we're going to want to make sure we add that SDF smooth. I think it can be a little bit too over the top, so you may want to restrict it a little bit, something maybe more like 25%. And now we can grab that remesh. I probably should have been doing that on some of the others as well to make the bevels a little bit more tight. And now we have our X remeshed. There's a couple of weird bugs here in that remesh. It could be good to exercise the symmetric X. Again, we're still getting that kind of artifact. This isn't something I've actually experienced. It could be because we've dropped that polygon count a little bit too much and it's struggling. We'll try symmetric Z as well. But if this doesn't work, so that's worked. That's gotten rid of it. It's made it a little bit weird up in the middle there, but that sure as hell. Okay, so now it's doing it here. I'm going to turn off the work plane so we can see it. See what the symmetric Y looks like. And that's not really helped either. So I'm probably going to want to say that the SDF smooth maybe needs more strength. And I'm just going to take you through this problem solving here in case you have any of these issues as well. Yeah, so maybe that's not as much of a concern as I thought it was, because if you drop the SDF smooth too much, then you seem to get some issues there. We can make that editable, and thankfully with this one, we can just call it the layer X. Duplicate those cubes, we're not going to need them. Duplicate, wow. Should we delete that? No, we'll leave the tube. What we'll do is put that in a folder and call it MISC, in case we want to come back to any of the objects. Have a look at all of these now. We have our icons, and this is a good point to start the simulation. These look good. The mesh is good. They're all pretty even, and these should behave quite well in the RBD simulation. But what we should do before we move into any simulations is save the scene. Okay, so what we're going to do to start off with the simulation is we're actually going to group these up, and we're going to call them icons. We're going to duplicate them, and we're going to turn those off, because what we're going to do with these ones is scale them way down to about, I don't know, 15% maybe. And then we're going to grab a cloner. I do want to note that this could get potentially slow. I'm going to drop them in a cloner, and we're going to set, it's already on grid array, that's good. We're going to set it to multi-instance, and to begin with, we're going to go 5 by 5 by 5. We're going to set the clones to random. We're going to dial them in there on each axis. And just to begin, what we're going to do is drop in a plane, move it below the clones, and I'm going to save incrementally now. We're starting up the simulation. We're going to right click on the cloner, add rigid body. We're going to right click on the plane and add a collider, and we're going to make the plane way bigger. Let's do 2000 by 2000 for now. I'm going to turn the plane off in the viewport temporarily. I'm going to bring the cloner up, and what we're going to do is play through and watch what happens. So it can usually take a couple of seconds to process and get going, and you're going to see the icons fall, which is what we want. We don't want this rotation though. So what we're going to do is add in a random effector. We're going to turn off the position, but we're going to give them all, say, a random rotation of 500. In my simulation, I had some kind of clashing with each other, but there used to be a bit of an issue with RBDs where if any of them were colliding with each other upon the initiation of the simulation, they would just ping really, really far away. Doesn't seem to happen so much with this new one. The best way around that, I believe, used to be the follow position and the follow rotation. I remember if you changed these values, that used to help them from flying away from each other. And I think you would usually keyframe this and then turn it off after like one frame. Doesn't look like we need it in this situation. And now we've got all these icons falling and hitting the ground. But what we want is a lot more of these, and we want them swirling about. But the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to set up our color. Now in this random, you can call this rotation, right? Because I think it's always good to rename things like the random effector and even make multiple of them to kind of know the use case for them and what they're going to be doing. And the reason for that is because I want to add another random effector, but I don't want to do anything with it. And what we're going to do is change the name of this to color. And we're going to make sure it's there in the effectors. We're going to come into the random and we're going to just turn off the position. We're going to go to fields and we're going to add something called a random field. We can just turn both of these off in the viewport, but what we're going to utilize this for is if you come to that first random, make sure the color mode is off, come to this new one we've called color, change it to fields color, and enable alpha/strength. And you can see what we can do now is get a bunch of random colors going through these icons. But if we go into the random field and go to color remap and go to gradient, what we can do here is add a couple of different blues that look like stuff from PS5, PS5, just sort of brand colors. And we can add a couple of different of these. A slightly more white one, slightly more blue one. Put them all in there. I don't really like the lighter ones too much, but just enough that there's variation. Some slightly kind of whiter ones too. Not too white. We can maybe make this one a little bit lighter. Maybe make this one a little bit more purple-like. And we can come back to this and change this. It's absolutely not set in stone. And then what we can do also is check that alpha strength. You can see there that that's going to abide a little bit closer to that color mapper. Color mapper, it's not particles. Color remap. You can see now you've got a little bit more control. And now there's some random color there. Let's make this one a little bit more white. Now I do want to take a moment to point out that with these colors that we're making here, the reason we're doing this in a different random effector is because this random field is going to affect the rotation, and we don't really want that. We just want the rotation from here. And I think it just generates a little bit more control, and it's nice to kind of separate things and do it in this way. Regarding the colors, I also want to take a second to explain what's going on with this. Is all we're really doing here is creating a color data input to then art direct in Octane. So the colors you pick here don't really matter. What we're doing is taking the information that this one is kind of this level of brightness and this one is darker and this one's white. And of course the spaces on this gradient do affect that and all sorts. And like I mentioned before as well, in the actual random effector using alpha strength here can have an effect on that as well. But that's something we can come back and change. But it's something I want to make sure that you understand and what we're doing and why we're doing it, and kind of understanding the level of input that it has and the importance of it. This is not you deciding the colors of your render. This is just us creating a random color attribute to then put into the material in Octane, and from there we'd have more control over the colors. And I think it's important to mention these things as you're making renders, and if you are learning renders and attempting to get better at it, I think it's important to understand how these things work and not feel like you're making final decisions here or slowing yourself down because you're worried about what you need to do and make decisions on. All we're doing here is creating a random color attribute. If anything, making this blue right now is more just for us to see it in the viewport and be able to kind of visualize a bit how things are going to look. So we're going to save this, but moving forward now, what we need to do is up the amount of clones and add some forces and get this moving. Okay, now let's move forward with the simulation. You're going to notice that just compared to the last couple of minutes, I've actually lost my tags, and that's because I recorded a little bit and then happened to suffer a crash. So I'm in a little bit of an older version of the scene, so the colors might look a little bit different as well, as I just corrected it. But what we're going to do now is add a cube. And if we right click on that cube and come to render tags and put display tag on it, and then we hit use here and we change this to lines. This is useful because what we're going to do is create this big box, and we're going to put all the clones in this big box. And with this display tag, we can see through it, which is very useful. So just to give you some values here, we want this to be pretty big. So let's do 1500 by, let's say 800 by 2500. And for now, that's probably going to be kind of what we want. We can make this cube editable, and we can go to polygon mode here and delete that top face. And what we're going to want to do is put the collider on that cube, but we're going to need more geometry in the cube. So what we can do is just hit U and S on the keyboard, or right click and subdivide right here. And we just want to do that a moderate amount of times. And then we're going to want to change this to convex hulls on the collision tag. And the reason I'm changing it to convex hulls is it's going to have better collisions. We could set this to triangle mesh and then set the collider side to both. But the collisions, and you will see this as we add more clones, won't quite be as good. As you can see, there's a couple falling through there, whereas on convex hulls, we're not really going to get any falling through. And this, of course, depends on your mesh, what you're colliding with. In most instances following this tutorial, I would imagine you're using a cube like this. So convex hull is probably the way to go in this scenario. Let's turn that off in the viewport. And what we want to do now is, well, actually we'll leave it on because we're going to add much more clones. Let's go to 10 by 10 by 10 for now. Make sure we keep saving this. And we can kind of reduce the lag of the simulation a little bit by making sure none of these are really colliding with each other. And that's going to help things a little bit, make it flow a little bit better. So keeping it spaced out is a good idea. And if we play through this now, you can see it's still running pretty quickly and we have much more clones. But what we want to do, and a lot of this is really going to come to life when I add in the PS5 controller. Unfortunately, I can't provide you with that, but I will give you the link to the model that I purchased on Turbo Squid. We're going to drop in a field force. As an example, I'm going to show you with a circle of what we can do here. And we set this to XZ, and we make the radius quite a bit larger. And this is where the display tag is a bit irritating because it's a bit hard to see what we're looking at. I don't think it massively matters the fact that we pull that down, but I'm doing it anyway. Pull this circle into the field force, select the circle, bring up the offset to 100. Let's set the strength to something like 500. We'll turn that off in the viewport temporarily. And we play through this now. And as we're playing through this as well, let's make sure we up our frame range, as the simulation can have a tendency to lag if you let it play all the way to the end and then attempt to recalculate itself. And now the cubes slam and they rotate about. I just said cubes. I've been making too many particle tutorials. It's not cubes, the icons. Now I had this flowing in the opposite direction in my render, and I believe the best way to do that is to just put a little minus on your strength and send it into the negative, and then it's going to wrap it around the other way. So as you can imagine, if you've watched my last tutorial on making cool particle swirls with object logos, and we're using the follow spline in the new particles, and there was a segment in that tutorial where I created a spline around the Porsche logo. We're basically going to do the same thing with the PS5 controller, and we're just going to draw a spline around the controller. But I kind of need the mesh in the scene to draw it effectively. So whatever object you're using, I would suggest putting in that spline, and then we're going to get this nice kind of shape movement around the object. So I have the PS5 controller in the scene, and what I'm actually going to do is just bring up the cube. If we press F3 here, I'm going to bring up the cube so the controller is kind of sitting near the floor there. And we're going to raise the clones up as well. But what we want to actually do, you can see we've got all these different meshes. We don't want to put a collider in every single one of those different pieces of geometry. So we're actually going to duplicate all of those, and I would do this for most objects that you have, and just hit connect objects and delete on those, and we can delete all the materials off of it. We can even delete the Octane object tag off of it. And the reason for that is because this object, we're subdividing on the object in the Octane object tags to make the render look better. You can see we've got a subdivision level of 2 there. We don't need this collider geometry to have high subdivisions, really. So we want this to be our colliding geometry, and then we would use this one in Octane to look at. And it's as simple as we just call this, for example, PS5 collider, and we put a collider tag on that, set it to both. Convex hulls, again, is probably going to be the more effective way to go. So setting it to both is actually kind of pointless there. I always forget that it eradicates that. And then this one will be the collider. And then we play through this now. Make sure we save. And we can see the shapes fall on top of the controller. And this is where the kind of kinks in the simulation came to life a little bit, was getting the shapes to not stick themselves to the controller and sit on there in a weird way. I don't think I actually messed with really any of the bounce values. I think I kept this quite close to default values. You can see there that's kind of actually fixed it, just changing the amount of bounce and the friction so it's not sticking to the controller. But if any more of that appears, there's more we can do to get rid of it. Like I said before, let's press F2 and go back to this spline. So what I want to do is, I'm going to turn off the cloner for a second. I'm going to outline, do NA here, I'm going to outline the controller. We kind of want this spline to flow, so I'll maybe start down here. We're going to outline the controller with our spline here, and it really doesn't have to be very perfect. And we can double click on this spline here to make that one a bevel. A bevel, I don't even know what you call this, a tangent. The spline, easy ease. And something like this probably works. Again, like I said, it's not massively important. What we need is the controller outlined, or whatever object you're using. And then we're going to delete the circle out of there, and we're going to put this spline in there, and we're going to set the offset to 100. And now when we play through this, turn on the cloner, hit save. Now when we play through this, if we have a look at this angle, we're going to have all of these clones following this shape of the controller. So they're going to dip in here, and they're going to dip back out, and then they're going to loop around. You could exemplify this with the cloner, with the spline quite a lot. You know, we could maybe mangle some of the shapes here so it kind of controls around a little bit more. But now with this spline, it seems like it's actually going the opposite direction, so I guess I need to set it back to 500. Probably depends on your spline, which is a little bit weird. Because of course with the circle I went the other way. So I want them flowing this direction, left to right. And now it's probably a good time to up the amount of clones that we have. So like I said, I went 25 by 25 by 25. Don't worry, I know that's a scary amount. It's going to get a little bit slower. And we want them kind of sitting up here. But there's one thing we want to do to this field force. Now we're working with this amount of clones, is we want to add something called a box field. And with this box field, we're just going to have it affecting the lower half of this cube here. And the reason for that is because when the cubes fall down, we don't want them to be affected by this field force when they're all the way up here, because then they're going to fly above the box, even if you raise the height of the box. I just think it's better to have them be affected by gravity, fall down, and then start to turn. I think you get a little bit of a nicer result. So we can probably just increase that inner offset as well, which is this inside box. And then we can play through this now and have a little look. And as you can see now, we're playing through it. That was a massive startup time. So if you have paused that to follow through, I do apologize. I think there's some things we could do to change this so we're not dealing with that startup time. I'm just going to come to the top view here. I don't seem to remember my startup times being that huge. Now we can watch all of these clones slam down, and they're going to start to be hopefully affected by that field force. We're probably going to have to up the strength of it though. You can see nonetheless now we're getting that effect. Okay, cool. So I think the best course of action here to art direct the simulation a little bit more is probably going to be to drop the amount of clones, and then we'll cache on a higher amount. But as you can see here, this is a really similar effect to what I had. Let's come down to 15 by 15 by 15 for now, and let's just make sure none of these are really colliding with each other. Yep, that looks good. And with this box field, I'm actually, okay, so well, that's not going to help anything. Let's make sure the box field is wide. And now let's have another little play through this. And the cubes are dropping, and now they're going to be more affected. Cool. It's kind of weird how, like, from 15 to 25, the amount of clones is like it really, really doubles up quite a lot. You can see we're getting more clones sticking now as well, but we're getting the movement. And I think this simulation really only looks good when we have like a really high amount. Let's bring up the clones. If we press F3, I am going to make the size of the cube quite a bit bigger. Because what I want to do, just so we've got those walls there, to try and attempt to get the clones to linger less on the controller, I'm going to try and have them fall a longer distance. Let's go to 25 by 20, 20 by 20, but let's leave the middle one the same for now. Awesome, so that's a decent bit more of a count for us to see more of what the final effect's going to look like. Again, I'm still not liking how much they're lingering there. So we'll try and get around that. I remember not massively minding it. In fact, I think there was one that was like stuck on the top of my render that I just actually left. But we don't really want, for example, like a circle there just lingering on the controller the whole time. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with this. I think we should raise the strength of the field force to 1,000. And I think we should probably tidy up the scene a little bit. So we can delete out that plane. We can call this box collider. These can stay together for now, and we'll delete the circle. We'll call this PS5 spline. We'll call this PS5 controller. Let's put those colliders together. Put the spline. Yep, that can kind of stay the same for now. That's clean enough. So we've got the field force on a higher strength. And regarding these collisions, you know, if we have a look at the PS5 collider, increase that bounce. Let's try triangle mesh and just see how that looks. And then we've got that higher force as well. And we begin to play through that after that like 30-second wait time. And I'm liking this more now with that level of force. Everything's a bit more aggressive now. That's more what I'm going for. Again, too many shapes lingering on the PS5 controller. Even more so, now we've changed that to triangle mesh. And similar to the box, you can actually see that the collisions are just a little bit less detailed. There's squares inside parts of the controller, a circle in the analog stick. There's some shapes just fully inside the controller here. We'll set this back to convex hulls just because I believe that that is going to be the better way. But one thing I want to discuss quickly before we go any farther is when I made this simulation, the only way of retiming it was to do Control-D and use this thing called the time scale in the scene. And what we would do is change the keyframes of this before cache. Usually you would retime something after cache, but now with the newer versions of Cinema 4D 2025, I think it came out, we can Alembic retime caches on these RBD objects. So I think we're going to wait to do that because it's going to be the easier way and the better way to do it. Back then, that was the only way I could retime it. But I also have a feeling that that was affecting the levels of collisions and stuff because it was running through the simulation so quickly. It also made it a little bit laggier, but the more I'm thinking about that, the more I'm thinking, how much did that affect the actual look of my render? And that's what you guys are here for. So I want to test it. So let's set a time scale of 3. Keyframe that. And then we'll come up to about frame... Oh, crap. Let's just make sure the cloner's turned off, and we're going to play through here. Well, we don't have to play through. We can come to 30 frames, keyframe again, holding control on that, and then come forward a frame and set this to 1, and then come forward a couple more frames and set this to like 0.2. So like this is what I did before. We're probably going to delete this and do the Alembic retime, but I want to see how this affects the simulation. Before I play through this, I do want to say this can make things even laggier. So we can see there now we've got all that extra speed, and then it's going to come through in about 30 frames, it's going to slow down. So that's how I was retiming. And the reason I did it about 30 frames is because then we could kind of get rid of the beginning of the animation, because I just kind of wanted it to start spinning around the controller. It doesn't seem like it's having much of an effect. So I'm glad about that. I wanted to clear it up just in case that was some sort of secret sauce in the simulation as to how I made it look the way I did. we're going to come back to the beginning here, and we're just going to save that for when we cache. So what we can do now, I want to say probably time to up the count, because that seems to be where a lot of the money is. If we press F2 here and we set our aspect ratio, I was running 1080 by 1920 it would have been. And then if we do Shift V and, well, we'll come back to our F1 view. But if we do Shift V and we'll turn this up, and then we can drop in our Octane dialog just to grab an Octane camera, set this to 135 and put the camera above the controller. And then we've got a camera there now. Maybe drop this a little bit. We're just going to try and push this to its final point before we go into Octane. So one other thing I did was a turbulence, and I also would put this same box field inside the turbulence, just so it's all connected there. I can't remember if I kept this on for the final render or not. You know, you can do a decent scale, decent strength. And then we're going to up the count. Let's do 25 by 25 there, and let's do 20 here, just to see if we can keep things a bit faster. Nothing is bashing against each other. We'll come back to that top view, and we'll play through this. And now that's feeling a little bit more like it. This is kind of the area I would start the simulation here. So it's like the controller's covered and then they're wiping off of it. And we seem to be doing okay for the amount of icons lingering on the controller. And we're also filling up the box, which is good. That's what we want. I think, well, we're not filling it up entirely. I think we'll make the box a bit smaller, kind of looking at the fact that we'll be at an angle of about here. What we should probably do is make the box similar to that size, because we don't need the box too big. And we want to try and squash the icons in more, because what's probably going to happen now is as we go through the simulation more and more, is it's probably going to spread those out. One thing I want to think about though is we'll come out the simulation, right? And we're going to turn off the PS5 controller for a second. And we're just going to drag these out of the cloner. Wherever they are in the scene, they're here. I'm going to drop these down. I'm going to paste in my icons from the other scene. Drop these down as well. They're a little bit bigger. That's going to affect the simulation. So, this is my icons from the initial scene there. You can see they're a little bit different. They're also thinner. So I thought I had them way thicker. So we can make those changes there. And you can see the polygon count is pretty similar. This one's getting darker a little bit quicker, but we're pretty much working with the same here. This is a little bit more dense, I want to say. Should we make those changes? Probably. It's probably going to be the smarter thing to do. So we're going to remesh all of these temporarily. Let's drop this one by, let's drop it to 50%. Remember, we're using values like 20% before. Can't use that anymore because now what was considered 20% is now 100%. So we're going to keep dropping these, although it's looking like I'm going to have to come down anyway. We'll do the X first. That's matching my old icons. X, we'll do circle. Circle is probably the closest, I want to say, out of all of them. We'll do 25% again. Yep, that's better. Circle. I'm going to do remesh. Triangle again, 25%. Cool. Want that out the null. Remesh. Triangle, not remesh. And then square. So square again looks quite close. 25. Yep, looks cool. Square. Okay, cool. We can get rid of those ones. Well, we'll just double check them actually. It's looking more even now. Looking pretty much the same. My shapes have maybe come out a little bit thicker. My circle was thinner and stuff, but it's not massively important. The square was bigger though, wasn't it? The square was actually touching the top. Circle was a bit smaller. Triangle was a bit smaller. And the X was probably a bit bigger. See, my shapes have came out much thicker, so if you want to go back and change that, my original shapes were much thinner than I have them here. I'm not really going to worry about that. So we'll delete those and we'll put these new ones back in the cloner. And now they're going to be a little bit lighter and they're a little bit bigger, which is going to fill things in. Like I said, with the box, we'll make it a little bit smaller, I want to say. Maybe just bring it down about this much. We want a decent enough room with the camera. It's probably too small. You know, we'll turn back on the PS5 controller. Get a bit bigger. Make it a little bit thinner. We'll play through this again now. Okay, so it seems like it's running a bit quicker now, which I'm quite happy about. And the icons being bigger is going to help fill the volume of everything. And I was thinking about that just before, which is why I wanted to pull the other icons in. The icons are very much bundling up at the edges, which is something I think we probably want to be a little bit careful of. I don't think we want all of that volume off screen bundling up there. But the other thing to remember is we're going to retime this and make it super slow. So we're probably not even going to be using this part of the simulation. I think what we do is we make this big box even thinner. Just so that bundling on the edges is happening. Let's imagine, if we think forward to Octane here. Let's imagine this is as far out in the camera as we want to go. And we'll match the box to that. Same at the top. And then we'll play through it now, but I'm going to max the count out, so we're going to go to 25. The issue now actually is the box is thinner than it, so we'll just make it just wide enough. Cool. The turbulence, I'm going to turn that off because I don't think I used that in my final version. I still wanted to show you it, but I don't think I used it. Might have to make the box a bit wider because we've got those kind of, that sticking on the side. But I think now, this is probably going to be close to the final version. Now we're not getting that kind of flattening in the middle and it bundling up in the edges. That thickness is retaining. And I like the way it sort of swallows up over the edges of the controller and stuff. I really like that. Now we've got all that nice movement. That seems pretty final to me. We've got one icon lingering. I'm not going to waste time in the tutorial getting rid of that. Although, if I were to change it, I would just mess with the rotation and the random effector, because I think those little things to do with how the icons are hitting the controller is probably going to help a little bit in getting rid of some of that stuff. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm not going to worry about the icons on the side, actually, either. I mean, again, if you bring down the friction, you bring up the bounce a little bit, that should help with that. Okay, so we're working pretty well here. In terms of what else I would change, what else I would do, I don't think there's a whole lot else. I feel like we're kind of on the money now, and we can get into rendering this in Octane. No, I feel like we're pretty much good to go in cache. So what we're going to do is come to the cloner and go to the rigid body tag and go to cache, and we're going to cache the scene. I'm going to cache 300 frames to give me a lot of time for retiming, and this cache speeds up everything a lot, which is nice. So now we have that cache all well and done, and you can see it's moving much quicker. It's so nice. It's so fluid now. It's like some sort of fluid simulation. It's lovely. Now we can go in that. Let's turn off the box collider in the viewport now. And let's bring up those safe frames. We don't want to see anything else. And that's cool. If you want it super quick like this, you can have it super quick like this. I don't want it super quick like this. I like things slamming and then slowing down. So I do like every render. Figured it out once and then I've never stopped. Right. Remapping. We're going to want to convert this to Alembic. I haven't actually done this with the RBDs yet, so I don't know if converting this to Alembic is going to create a 55 gigabyte file that's really slow, but we're going to try it. We're going to save this now after cache. I'll save incrementally as well. If you did just want it at normal speed, you can just bring this offset back, bring it to about -65, play through it. You get something like that. Lo and behold, I did the Alembic retime, and it was just, dude, it was so slow. So I don't know how much I want to use that method for these sorts of things. I think it's something you could maybe do at the end, but it's so slow that then you can't even really work with it. So I want to take us back to what we did with the time scale, and then we're just going to recache this. So I'm going to save this incrementally, and we're going to clear the object cache for now. Make sure that's all working right. Yep. Let's turn off the cloner timescale. Let's set this to 3. Like I said, we're going to go to frame 30. We're going to put a keyframe here. We're going to go forward a frame, set this to 1. So that's it back at default speed. And then let's go forward about 10 frames and set it to like 0.2. And then let's come up to like frame 70 and set it back to 1. So it's going to come down to 0.2 and then slowly speed up. And let's go to frame 300 and set it back to 3. So it's going to slam. So it's going to slam in. And then it's going to slow down and then slowly get faster and then speed off again. If we come to the F curve here, we can see we have this timescale animation here. We press H on that. What we can actually do is just mess with the F curve of this slightly. And this feels okay. Maybe just want it a little bit lighter. But this is what I'm happy with. All we're really using this value of 3 for is to get that first bit out of the way, because we aren't really going to use the offset now. So it's really just to get that first bit out of the way, speeds through it, blah, 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 blah. What we can do now is just turn that back on. We don't have to play through this. I'm pretty sure these values are going to be quite good. We're just going to cache the object again. So now that cache is complete. Let's play through this. Is the offset still there? The offset is still there. We'll take off the offset and speed through, and then they slow down. We're going to give it a bit of an offset. Still, let's do -20. Bit too much. -30. We just want a quick snap. Boom. There we go. Slows down and then it speeds up. And slowly speeds up. That's way quicker than the Alembic retime. And then it speeds up, and now it's going to end at about frame 270-ish. So we can cut that timeline down. We'll watch that again now. Speeds up. And now it kind of loops as well, which is awesome. So it shaved that, and then we'll map the camera to it. So with the camera, I'm going to duplicate it, and what we're going to do, we're going to set this to 200. I'm going to come up here. That'll be our max amount with the camera, so we'll keyframe that on the last frame. And then we're going to zoom in here. Set another keyframe. No, I want to zoom in. Set another keyframe. And we're going to grab our F curve on the camera. We're only going to animate the position Y, so we can just bring that up, tighten that in, and then have it slam about a decent way up, and then take that last one and loop it around like that. So the same movement, it's going to slam up, although we're going to want this tighter to match this. It's going to slam up, slow down, and slowly speed up again. Not enough movement, so we can have this closer as well. Now I want more movement throughout the animation. So as the animation's speeding up, the camera's zooming out, the camera's zooming out, speeding up, and then they're going to do it together. You get the point. I'm not going to go too deep on that, but you can mess with that to kind of get the effect you want. Cool. So animation is already done before Octane. Let's do some Octane stuff. So let's open up the live viewer, hit render. Lock the live viewer, change it to path tracing, and we have a awful render. So we're going to turn off the collider. We're going to turn on the other controller. This is all textured and stuff. May do a tutorial on this one. I've done some PS5 controller tutorials in the past, but I may do one on this controller because this controller model is very nice. So let's drop in a texture environment. Let's make it black. Call it shadows. Duplicate it. change it to visible environment, make it white. We're going to go through this, call it background. I can't remember if I did 2 separate lights or not. We'll find out. Drop in a light, target it. We're going to target the controller. I definitely did 2 separate lights. So we're going to do light IDs. In that F2 view now, we can change that to perspective. Turn off both the background and the shadows in the viewport. This is going to be our controller light. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to call this PS5_light. We're going to make sure the light ID is on 1. And then on the cloner, we're going to add a extension C40 Octane object tag. Go to the object layer. Enable use light pass enable use light pass mask. Okay. I got it that time. We're going to turn off light number 1, right? And we want this to be light number 1. So why is it not working? Does it need to be on the object? It needs to be on the object. Okay. And then now this light is only going to affect the PS5 controller, right? So I've clearly done that the other way around in my other render. So we'll do that. But on these Octane object tags, on all these different parts of the controller, turn off light number 2, because we're going to put in a light, make that light number 2, and that'll be the particle light. We can turn this off in the camera, turn off in the shadow, so we're not looking at it. And I want this light to sort of just sit above the controller. And then we can duplicate that light and call it, I don't know, icon light. Set that to number 2, so now the controller will ignore it and the icons will see it. Drag it back. We'll kind of situate it with the same thing. You know, do it the same lighting direction, just sitting back. But then let's set up the camera imager. And I'm going to drop in my LUT, my trusty LUT I use on every render ever. Bring up the highlight compression. Let's drop the exposure. And all of that. Cool. I'm going to bring this PS5 light a little bit closer. I just kind of want some highlights here. I'm probably going to want some reflections too on these bits of like glass and stuff. I think for now this looks good. And, you know, if I just delete that Octane camera tag off the other camera, the other kind of angle I would take is if you drop a target on that. This is just for like a still. And we target the PS5 controller, drag it back on the Z, and then lower it. This is more kind of probably the angle I had, just sort of looking down like that. I mean, we can do that with the animated camera, but that's definitely more the angle I had. It's not straight up, just sort of back a little bit. If we were to do that with this, because we're only on the animated on the Y, especially if we delete that track. If we were to do that. The box. We need to turn that off in Octane as well. Now we're getting there. We're getting a render. Save it incrementally. And for the material, last but not least, told you Octane would be quick. We are going to grab, was it specular or universal? Oh, universal. Put that on the cloner. We need to turn it into glass. So to do that, we go to the transmission. We change it to specular. And then I believe we go to the specular and we make it white, do we? Or is it the albedo? We make it black. And then do we make the specular white? God, I can never get this right. Which way around is it? That's how you do it. Transmission, you make the transmission white. That should have been really obvious. We change, we turn on fixed shadows, and then we're going to grab a instance color, and we're going to grab a random walk medium. Just first though, let's grab an RGB spectrum, make it blue, put that in the albedo, put this in the medium, give it a whole bunch of roughness. Does that need to go in the objects too? It does. Cool. And then let's drop the density way down. Oh, that looks so good. Oh my god. Dude, that looks so good. Let's put the instance color in there instead. But in the instance color, we want to drag in the cloner, I believe. We may have to drag in the other thing, but drag that in and we should get our random colors. Cool. See that? And then we can put in a gradient. And this is what I meant earlier. We can now control the colors. And we can do whatever colors we want. Let's get a bit of a lighter blue in there. And then in the Octane camera, I would probably yank the saturation a little bit. Yank some vignetting. I definitely had darker colors. I definitely had less white. And the white I did have would have been a little bit blue. I want to swap these around, I think. It's probably a bit too purple in one of them. Let's increase the density to like 25. Too high, 15. Just to see the colors more. 10. 10 seems like a closer value. Just checking those saturation levels again. We don't want them too over the top. But this is coming out a little bit too purpley. That seems a bit better, but again, I don't want that much kind of purple colors in there, so I want more of these like really deep blues. Something more like that. Yeah, I think I just want... I mean, we could try with that gradient in the albedo as well. But I feel like that's going to eliminate too much of the see-throughness from it. We could try it in the transmission. That could have been something I'd done. Or I could have just had a lighter blue in the transmission. But then again, that's going to mess with the kind of variation we've got here. I think really what we want to do is probably just get a bit more specific here with what we're doing. Less blending together, because you've got to remember when you're blending together like this and pull this color too, so we probably want more of a snap on each color, more deliberateness in between each part, just so it's all blocked off, and then you're not really going to get those blends between the colors that we don't really want to see. We could afford a little bit of a blend in the middle there. Again, I don't want too much purpley kind of colors. Go a bit lighter on that one. That's feeling more like it. Now we're feeling more of just a bit of a punch in between the colors. I'm gonna let that side of the white kind of lean through into a bit of a blue. And I'm gonna leave the colors there because I could play with it for so long and this tutorial is already going on. Let's add a bit more contrast and a bit more punch. What we can also do is bring up the shadows so it's not super dark in our primary environment here. So we can keep bringing that up there just to get rid of those like dark blacks at the bottom. And in the background here, I would set the power to about 5 to push that to real white. If you don't want it like that, you can set it to black and then you're not really gonna see through as much. I think I had mine on white though. And that's pretty much the render. Play through this. Let's go closer to the end. That looks really, really cool. We're seeing a bit too much on the edge there towards the end, but we can fix that. So just make sure we're zoomed in a little bit there. And that's just because I pulled back with the target. That icon light is maybe a bit too big. A bit too over the top. We can bring it up a little bit more there. this PS5 light. See what we're working with here as well. Let's make it a bit taller, bring it forward a bit. Don't really need a second light on the controller, I feel like. And that's pretty much my render. I feel like I'm pretty happy with leaving you guys with this. Again, I would just sort of push a bit more contrast out of that, but need to be careful that we don't blow out the image. Could my render been a bit more like that? I don't know. It's probably a bit more like this. Something about it just doesn't feel quite as punchy as my render. Maybe these shadows should be darker. It could be to do with the icon light as well. Let's try this. Let's drop the light. Let's make it bigger. And then let's take a second icon light and put it at the bottom. So now we're lighting these icons from both sides. We could probably delete the target off them and fix the rotation as well. I want to say this is probably more to what I had. Let's come back a bit in the simulation. That's feeling punchier now. We've got the light at the top and the light at the bottom. That's definitely a bit closer to what we had. Have a look at this other camera. Simulation maybe could have done with being a bit taller, I want to say. In terms of the width of the box. And sometimes you don't find this stuff out and then you have to go back and change it again. I think maybe the focal length here can help with that. But also just not being so far back. You know, if we're above the controller, we're gonna solve quite a bit of that. Look, I'm happy with this. I think you guys at this point know how it was made. I could keep making little tweaks, but that's pretty much the render. It looks wonderful. You guys know the technique now. This is how I made it. Really big shout out to the guys that made all the RBD tutorials when these came out, because I certainly leveraged those. But this was how I made this render. I didn't expect it to be so long, but apparently it was. I'm going to make a similar tutorial over my Patreon, but we're going to do this with the new particles. Similar kind of effect, looking down on the PS5 controller with all the particles zooming around it. So be on the lookout for that. It'll be out within the next day or so. Like I said, first 5 people to hit that link get my Patreon for free for the first month. But if you missed that, then there'll be a code for 50% off using the code RBD. Then one last thing we could probably do is increase that vignetting. That's definitely what I did to get that punchiness. Get rid of some of those highlights on the sides. That's looking a bit more like my render now. Go a bit heavier on the vignette, and there you go, guys. So thanks again for watching. More tutorials on the way. Appreciate all your support, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube. Things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm. Breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.